An anonymous 1859 review of Herman Melville's The Confidence Man reflects, quote, "One of the indigenous characters who has figured long in our journals, courts, and cities is the confidence man. His doings form one of the staples of villainy and an element in the romance of roguery. Countless are the dodges attributed to this ubiquitous personage, and his adventures would equal those of Jonathan Wild," close quote. Yeah, thank you. This portion of the paper is in the abstract printed in the program. So I'll kind of jump down a little bit. And I thanked for Matthew Seybold for his work on this, for his comments on Twain and Melville vis-a-vis the confidence man. And I'll jump down a little bit and note that in yesterday's keynote presentation, John Lowe mentioned Johnson Jones, Hooper, Simon Suggs, whose iconic line, "It's good to be shifty in a new country," lends yet more credence to the con artist as an American original. If the confidence man is somehow uniquely American, then we might well be tempted, along with Melville's 1859 reviewer, to label this figure a, quote, indigenous character, one that emerged from a new country rather than the European metropoles. But what of the truly indigenous confidence man? In keeping with Professor Lowe's talk, we might think of Gerald Vizenor's Almost Brown and Herald of Orange, both of whom used their narrative wiles to bamboozle the settler establishment. But I would like to turn our attention to another indigenous artist who made extensive use of the con man motif. Born in Leone, American Samoa in 1920, John Kneubuhl was an Afakasi playwright whose dramas traversed Ivy League theater and Hollywood culture industries, as well as the oceanic modernism that integrates metropolitan avant-garde technique with Polynesian cultural practices. And I'll just mention Afakasi is the Samoan term for somebody who is has part European background and part indigenous Samoan. His dramaturgical career also spanned 20 years as a TV writer for programs such as Medic, The Fugitive, and Star Trek. In this presentation, I provide a broad overview of Kneubuhl's con artist characters and devote a little bit more attention to his most elaborate dramatization of the confidence man in Night of the Two-Legged Buffalo, a 1966 episode of The Wild Wild West, which exemplifies Kneubuhl's lifelong engagement with post-colonial thematics as well as indigenous and metropolitan comic traditions, including the dramatist's inspiration for the program in an historical Native Hawaiian con artist, Sam Amalu. As Judith Lee suggests, quote, "Rhetorical and thematic matters of empire give American comic rhetoric what Edward Said calls a contrapuntal harmony, weaving discernible restatements, inversions, and modulations into a rich and complex whole," close quote. I've long believed that Kneubuhl exemplifies Said's vision of contrapuntalism insofar as his life was characterized by an exilic, quote, plurality of vision that impelled him to work within and against the grain of the metropolis, from modernist experimental theater to Hollywood's culture industries. After graduating from Honolulu's prestigious Punahou School, Kneubuhl studied drama under Thornton Wilder and Elmer Rice at Yale. Following service with naval intelligence in World War II, Kneubuhl was named Associate Art Director for the Honolulu Community Theater. Working 20 years then as a Hollywood screenwriter, Kneubuhl returned to the Pacific to serve as an educator in Samoa, Tonga, and also here in Pearl City, Hawaii at Leeward Community College. Between 1942 and 92, Kneubuhl wrote widely for stage and screen, penning 9 plays, 4 film scripts, and dozens of teleplays. According to Jackie Pualani Johnson, Kneubuhl's dramas foreground, quote, "the retelling of historical truths, a passionate belief in the majesty of Polynesian culture, and themes of alienation, spirituality, and allegiance to family." Kneubuhl's writing also reflects his lifelong experience of and appreciation for the Faliaitu, a Samoan comic drama that directs irreverent humor against the solemnity of the status quo. Quote, "Caricature, hyperbole, and satire characterize plots that often turn on ridicule of authority figures," writes Caroline Sinabayana. "In the Faliaitu, normative status roles are reversed. The high are made low, and the world momentarily turned upside down is found in carnival traditions elsewhere, close quote. Given his admiration for the shape-shifting clowns of the Folliaitu, it's little wonder that Kneubuhl returned again and again to the figure of the confidence man, both as a villain and as a trickster hero. Con artists appear as central characters in Kneubuhl's early 1942 plays Saint Mac and The Moon and I, as well as his teleplays for programs such as James A. Michener's Adventures in Paradise, to which he contributed 6 episodes. While the episode The Perils of Penrose finds a grave-robbing European adventurer posing as a Melanesian shaman, Touch of Genius features 2 nefarious art swindlers reminiscent of the King and the Duke in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Not surprisingly, Kneubuhl's TV westerns also foreground con artist characters. The magician, an episode of Gunsmoke, sees Marshall Dillon sidelined by Jeremiah Dark, a patent medicine salesman and card sharp who uses dramaturgy to seek justice for his wronged family. Kneubuhl's Wagon Train episode, The Isaiah Quickfox Story from 1965, likewise celebrates the way in which a Native American trickster stages a spectral drama that illuminates his people's decimation at the hands of murderous settlers. With its climactic excursion into a dangerous cavern, the episode in some ways reads as a critical recasting of Tom Sawyer's climactic confrontation with Injun Joe. As suggested by their biblical names, these figures operate as Jeremiatic prophets who decry the violence and oppression levied by the community at large, an idea that also informs Strangers in Our Own Land, the first true episode of Hawaii Five-0. As I've argued elsewhere, this rewriting of Elmer Rice's 1923 play, The Adding Machine, revolves around Benny Kalua, played by Simon Oakland, a native Hawaiian nightclub owner infuriated by colonization of the islands. While entertaining tourists at his tiki bar, Benny cons others into murders of key developers and assimilationists. Here again, name symbolism becomes important. Benny's last name, Kalua, the Hawaiian word for double-stranded, suggests his duality as a con artist as well as the alienation of the indigenous person living under colonization. I have to thank my colleague Kealani Cook at UH West Oahu for that observation about Benny's name. Kneubuhl's most sustained treatment of the indigenous con artist may be found in The Night of the Two-Legged Buffalo, which is an episode of the series The Wild Wild West. During the mid-60s, Kneubuhl wrote 8 episodes for this program, which brings together the TV Western with the spy story and in some ways inaugurates steampunk science fiction. While the frame narrative of the Wild Wild West revolves around the exploits of 19th century Secret Service agents James West and Artemis Gordon, personally charged by President Grant with troubleshooting a precarious empire, the program also suggests that American exceptionalism and expansionism depends on frenetic and frantic trickery. With recourse to his own bicultural experience, Kneubuhl created the program's most celebrated villain, Dr. Miguelito Lovelace, played by Michael Dunn, a Californio mad scientist dispossessed in the wake of the US-Mexican War. With his first appearance in The Night the Wizard Shook the Earth, Dr. Lovelace points to a map on a tract of Southern California land and declares, quote, "All this once belonged to my grandmother, Doña Maria Concepcion de Vega, and to her brothers and their wives. I am the only one of her descendants left. The Spanish crown took it, and now the state of California owns it. I want it back, but the state refuses to return it to me. Piracy," close quote. Kneubuhl developed one additional subaltern villain anti-hero in the episode The Night of the Man-Eating House in 1920. Lawrence Liston Day, played by Hurd Hatfield, sheds his mimicry to declare, "Me llamo Diaz. Diaz, do you hear? Not Day. Diaz. Day was the name my grandfather chose because he wanted to belong to the gringo's way of life," close quote. As with Benny Kalua and many of Kneubuhl's other characters, Day Diaz must take on a duality that approaches the stratagems of the con artist. The Night of the Two-Legged Buffalo represents a different take on this insurgent figure. West and Gordon here escort a Polynesian dignitary, the Prince of the South Sea Coral Islands, played by Nick Adams, from San Francisco to Washington, D.C., where he will sign a treaty on behalf of his regal father. The treaty will ensure favorable U.S. relations with the island kingdom, which also hosts a group of influential American missionaries. Ignoring the advice of his escorts, the prince insists on stopping at a luxurious health spa in the southwestern desert, a Spanish fantasy-themed resort that appears to be a cross between the Montezuma and the Castaneda in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and other Harvey House properties such as La Posada in Winslow, Arizona. Forgive that digression. That's another interest of mine, are these Spanish fantasy resorts in the Southwest. Complete with an exotica-style suite for the prince, the setting itself is a fascinating heterotopia that sets the stage for illusion and subterfuge. Apparently kidnapped, the prince turns out to be in league with a trio of European schemers. He intends to embarrass the Americans, provoking his vengeful father to wipe out the mission. Quote, all my life, he complains, my dear Papa and his missionary friends have told me what to like and what not to like as if I didn't have any mind whatsoever of my own, close quote. With the meddling Europeans and Americans out of the way, the prince will be able to inherit his kingdom and his autonomy. Quote, I shall be king to do whatever I want without influence from the outside, close quote. At the climax of the episode, the prince stages a buffalo hunt with Jim and Artie standing in for the eponymous game. Not surprisingly, Weston Gordon foiled the prince and his unscrupulous Confederates. In the interest of the treaty, however, they must turn a blind eye to the prince's shenanigans. So I'm going to try to play a clip here that's about 1.5 minutes long. Let me see if it'll go for us.
I'd say untruthful is my favorite.
Any idea how you are? By all rights, you should be in jail.
Come now, gentlemen. Divine right of kings and all that rot, you know. Besides, I couldn't sign a treaty in jail now, could I?
Try to double-cross your own father, kill me. Artemis, you tell him.
Oh, no, not me. It'd take me all day.
Trivia, gentlemen. After all, I am a barbarian. What do you expect?
I expect a treaty signed, sealed, and delivered.
The treaty is such a bore. All right, your government shall have a treaty.
Your Highness, don't you even feel a little remorse?
For what, my dear Artemis? For doing what comes naturally to a half-naked savage from the South Seas? You know, like I even tried to cook you as well as kill you.
Wonder which of you is real, the gourmet bon vivant or the jolly lancer on horseback.
I haven't decided yet, James, but when I am king, as I soon shall be, we can decide then. You will come and visit me, won't you? We could even hunt together.
Hunt what?
I won't dream of telling you now. I do adore surprise endings, don't you?
Okay, thank you. In his writer's commentary on The Night of the Two-Legged Buffalo, Kneubuhl shares his opinion that Nick Adams, third in line behind Red Buttons to play the role of the prince, quote, did very well in his own way, close quote, despite the fact that he was not a comedian. Adams was, of course, most well known for his starring role as Johnny Yuma in the TV series
The Rebel.
The Rebel, that's right, The Rebel, where he played a kind of a weird plot. He played a Confederate veteran wandering around trying to become a writer, I think. Showcasing Adams' performance, this scene offers a fit summation of the episode as a whole. Kind of reminds me of Matthew Seybold's description of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It's a veritable festival of con artists in which every character enjoys at least two personae, including that of Artemis Gordon, who plays the prince for a little while. Although he briefly takes on the cover of hotel guest Roger Colby, West returns to his role as Secret Service agent and continues to probe for the, quote, real prince, suggesting the binary of gourmet bon vivant and jolly lancer on horseback. Interestingly, the original script of the episode, which is available at the American Radio Archive and Museum in Thousand Oaks, California, holds an additional phrase for this exchange. Kneubuhl's dialogue has West referring to the prince as, quote, the jolly lancer on horseback spearing his own long pig, close quote. Of course, long pig is the 19th century Pacific pidgin term for human flesh consumed through cannibalism. In other words, West can only understand the prince as a civilized connoisseur or a savage cannibal, but the prince will not gratify West positivism. According to Kneubuhl's script notes, the agents, quote, exchange helpless glances. He hasn't changed. He will never change, close quote. Unlike many of Kneubuhl's indigenous con artists who struggle to reconcile their indigenous and subaltern subject positions, the prince revels in his multiple identities. He suggests that Western images of the barbarian and the half-naked savage from the South Seas are just Western stereotypes that he might deploy alongside his persona of the gourmet bon vivant. Indeed, after the fashion of the bricoleur, the prince amalgamates these personae as he pleases. The jolly lancer spearing his own long pig integrates European and Euro-American violence with the Polynesian deployment of cannibalism to inspire terror among enemies. I'm thinking here of chapter 1 of Jeff Sanborn's book, Sign of the Cannibal. Hence the Outre episode title, which replaces long pig with two-legged buffalo, and as well a Euro-American and European military tactic all too common in the age of empire building, that of lancer. All of these categories and stereotypes become unmoored and free-floating in the prince's trickster discourse. Neither barbaric nor noble savage, the prince emerges as a rascal, to be sure, but an operator no more or less shady than any other principal character with whom he jockeys in a struggle for geopolitical advantage. Kneubuhl derived the energy, and this is where I'm heading toward my conclusion, not to worry, I hope. Kneubuhl derived the protean energy of the prince from an historical indigenous con artist with whom he studied at Punahou School. During his conversations with producer Michael Garrison, Kneubuhl recalls, quote, I immediately thought of a Hawaiian friend of mine. He's passed on now, but he's very famous in the Hawaiian Islands, and he was a great poseur, check forger, con man, federal prison. His name was Sam Amalu. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be funny if I spoofed that kind of tradition by characterizing Sam Amalu in one of these shows? And it would be brilliant if someone like Zero Mostel would play it, because it's that same glandular, huge, large, and yet oddly prissy, careful kind of comic mask and mannerism, close quote. In his remarks, Kneubuhl provides a window into his transnational aesthetic, which integrates personal experience of Oceania with Western traditions and conventions. In this case, Kneubuhl brings together Zero Mostel's, quote, glandular comedy stylings with the pranks of a Kanaka Maoli trickster. Bearing aristocratic titles such as Prince of Keawe, Amalu graduated from Punahou in 1935. Throughout his career, he took on many poses, ranging from U.S. Army officer to Indian Maharaja. His culminating role was that of a representative for a Swiss presidium offering to purchase several Sheraton hotels in Waikiki, alongside 2 other large tracts of land in the Hawaiian Islands. The deal evaporated when Amalu was arrested in Seattle and ultimately incarcerated for passing bad checks in California. While serving time at Folsom, and for years after his release, Amalu wrote a column for the Honolulu Advertiser called The World of Sammy Amalu. Here's a little slide. There's very con artist looking image of Sam Amalu and a headline about the scandal. And here's another one. When he was in prison, he was noted as being so charismatic that he practically ran the prison. And here's a column. Here's his column, The World of Sammy Amalu. It was a humorous column initially published as letters that he sent to Thurston Twigg Smith, another Punahou classmate and editor of the Advertiser. He's also the descendant of one of the Paoli elite who overthrew the Hawaiian kingdom. The column was temporarily suspended when Sammy began criticizing prison conditions, and then restored after Twigg Smith appealed to Ronald Reagan, the governor of California, and Amalu promised to abstain from commentary about his incarceration. Whatever his medium, Amalu conducted himself as an indigenous performance artist who not only, quote, provided his audience with a measure of distraction to alleviate the crashing boredom of their days, close quote, as he put it, but he did so in a way that challenged the machinations of US capitalism and imperialism. Dean Itsuji Saranio finds in Amalu a, quote, kalohi, or mischievous trickster who challenged U.S. colonization in Hawaii. He writes, Amalu appropriated the language of capital to expose how economic benefits that statehood and tourism seemingly promised the working class actually helped Hawaii's elite insulate themselves and expand their economic power. Amalu stated, quote, with authority, you can prick, you can needle, but you must never bludgeon, close quote. Here's my conclusion. Like Amalu, Kneubuhl needled authority with small screen fictions that use popular generic conventions to dramatize the traumatic legacy of empire building throughout the US borderlands. As a wily Polynesian aristocrat bent upon destabilizing American hegemony in Oceania, the Prince of the South Sea Coral Islands emerges an example of Kneubuhl's own Kalohi TV aesthetic and an homage to a kindred spirit who shared his contrapuntal vision. Thank you.